Welcome back, everyone. So this is part 4 of chapter 8. In this video, we're going to talk about how linguistics influence our thinking and thought. So again, in the last videos, if you haven't watched those yet, then we talked about language, what it is, how we process it, how we learn language, as well as second languages. So now we're going to take all that information we gained on what language is and see how it relates to how we think. So there are a few different hypotheses that talk about how language connects to how we think, but the main one we're going to talk about, and the main one I want you guys to focus on, is the linguistic relativity hypothesis. So this hypothesis says that language determines what we are capable of thinking. In other words, our current view of the world is influenced by our language. So pretty much what it's saying is, if you think about with young children, their thought of the world, what they play or what they imagine, is limited to what they're able to form language about. So for instance, if a kid doesn't know the word for dragon and space, then when they're playing, they're not going to be playing about a space knight fighting off the space dragon and winning the heart of, of his kingdom. That's not something he's going to be able to think about because he doesn't have the language yet that has taught him about those concepts. So the language that we have determines what we're capable of thinking. That's also why as you grow up, then you're learning more words, you're learning more complicated words and meanings, and this allows you to have some more complicated abstract thinking. You're able to do what's called critical thinking, which is taking everything that you know and connecting it, even if it doesn't necessarily seem relevant. So this is the influence of language. It influences how we think, how efficiently we categorize experiences, as well as how much detail we attend to or pay attention to. So language can also influence our perception, our decisions, and drawing conclusions. So again, based on our experiences with language, we're going to perceive things based on how we can describe them. And we describe things using language. So if you don't know the word, for instance, chartreuse, you can't describe something as chartreuse. You might not perceive it as being the color chartreuse. What you perceive it as is kind of a yellowish green. So even just the way you perceive something is influenced based on the language we can use to describe it. And then, of course, what we can draw conclusions about based on our experience with language. Now, sexist language also influences our perceptions, our decisions, and the conclusions we draw. So that's why avoiding sexist language is very important. You have also probably seen this where people talk about boys' toys versus girls' toys. That's very sexist language, and that's influenced our perceptions and decisions of when we grow up, what clothes we wear, what hobbies we choose to do, things like that. Where if as you were younger, someone constantly was telling you about boy things and girl things, you're going to take that sexist language from your younger years, and it's going to influence your decisions later on in life and the conclusions we draw about others because of that sexist language. Now, we can also see these influences on other types of language, like racist language, or really any other type of mean language can influence our perception. And so that's why we really want to avoid and teach people not to use sexist, racist language, because it influences others around them as well as themselves in both their perceptions, their decisions, and the conclusions that they draw about other people, and that's very harmful to society. Now, what about animals? Can animals acquire a language? So, for instance, can a chimpanzee acquire a language? Now, if you didn't know, a chimpanzee is one of the closest relatives evolutionarily to humans. So they're the most similar to humans according to evolution. So they are the animal that we would think would be most likely to be able to communicate or to use language, since they're the most similar. And what we find is even though they can't necessarily use verbal language, they are able to use a complex symbol array. So that's what this image is showing on the right, is an example of an animal using symbols to communicate with their handler. Now, the specific example is actually, that's Kanzi, who's a bonobo, so not a chimpanzee, but a bonobo, that's able to communicate with psychologists. So the psychologist pictured here is Sue Savage Rumbaugh, and she has made some really cool findings using these symbols to communicate with bonobos, especially with Kanzi here. Now, what this graph shows is it shows the rate of Kanzi's symbol acquisition. In other words, the amount of symbols she's able to use. So you can kind of equate the number of symbols to the number of words. And they measured the amount of words she was able to learn over a 17-month period. And this is her age on the bottom. So they started when she was about 28 months old. So just over 2 years is when they started. And you can see that in months, she started learning pretty slowly. But then at about 36 months of age, she started to be able to acquire or learn these symbols much quicker. And this is actually something very similar to what we see in young children when they acquire language. Young babies, when they don't start learning words right away, it takes a while, and they'll start with maybe one word and then move on to 2 or 3 words, and slowly they'll build and they'll have a small repertoire of words, and then suddenly they'll hit an age where they'll be able to learn a large number of words at any time until they have quite a few number of words in their repertoire. So we see that Kanzi, the bonobo, actually is able to acquire the symbol language in a similar way to humans. So that's it for part 4 on how linguistic influences on thinking and whether animals can acquire language.